In this video, I'm going to show you how I made this chain. It's a simulation, a rigid body simulation of an actual chain. This is an animation that I created for the title sequence of my video series, Zen, a 21st Century Approach. You can see the actual animation in use if you check out any of those episodes. Now, making this chain is not the easiest thing in the world. There are some bugs or limitations, depending on how you look at it, in how these simulations work. This, by the way, is the newest version of Blender currently available, version 3.2.1. And I created this whole thing on a much older version some time ago. And I like to check whenever a new version comes out to see any improvements that they've made in the various physical simulations. And sure enough, they are making improvements slowly, but these problems still exist. And I'm going to show you how I fixed a very serious problem with simulating a chain. First, I'm going to show you what happens when you construct a chain without using my fix. I'm going to hit play and let's see what happens. Uh-oh, it broke. Yes, indeed. But we can fix that. The reason that it broke is because gravity is at play here for my simulation, and you would think, oh, well, the chain isn't strong enough perhaps to hold up that huge bell. And in a manner of speaking, that's true, but it's not in that way that you would think. It's simply because the resolution along both the axes of the Z, in this case being affected by gravity, so the motion, so that spatial resolution, if you will, but also the temporal resolution in terms of how many times the simulation runs per second. If you were to radically increase that setting to perhaps millions of times per second, then maybe it could survive that kind of tension. I did not check to find out, and I don't know if it's even capable of doing something in that resolution. It's not practical, obviously. I came up with a better solution that I will show you right now. And that is using a rigid body constraint. If we look here on the right side, I've got it already open. Now, the other thing to show you is I've got all of the chain links selected here. And I will be making changes to them all at the same time to save time. There's a little trick involved with that most of you, if not all, probably already know, but in case you don't, or if you're new to Blender, the thing to do is when you're making any change that you want to apply to all of the selected objects, you hold Control while you're making whatever that change is. And in this case, that is over here, I'm going to click the Enable button for the rigid body constraint. So I'm holding Alt now and clicking Enable. So now they all have that enabled. And it should immediately function now because I'm not making a change that requires rebaking. I'll explain that in a second. First, let's verify that I don't actually need to rebake it. And there you go. Now, instead of breaking, when I hit play, it actually stretched, it fell into place. And now it just got struck by the hammer. And look at how beautifully that chain is swinging and the bell is swinging. Everything looks great. That just came back to the beginning of the animation. So, back at frame 0, you can see that the chain is loose. This is the way that I assembled it. If we zoom in nice and close, you can see that there's a little bit of a gap there. Let's go really, really close to this one here. See, you can actually see through the opening there. I'm going to get right in there now. So you can see through the gap in the chain. This is the way I assembled it. And so when I hit play, and I will do so at this zoomed in level here, and you will see as soon as I hit play, gravity will begin and it will all fall into place. Boom. And it's actually swinging a little bit because it got struck earlier in the simulation. Now, while we're zoomed in, you can see something else that I had to do. And I will go to a wireframe mode here so we can really see what's happening. Look at the shape that I've made here for the link. All of these links are identical. I just duplicated one and rotated it 90 degrees and then dropped down and duplicated again, and et cetera, et cetera. So these are all the very same geometry for each of these links. But you can see I've made an interesting shape here so that it's like a jigsaw. They want to sit nicely and snugly together. They're held into place. That's to prevent it wobbling too much and jumping around, which is another problem with these simulators. And so you can see that by having this interlocking feeling and not merely what would be the anticipated interlocking, if we look at the outer edge, it's just a round edge. And that's what you would expect to see on the inner edge as well. But as I said, without actually bothering to show you, you can find out yourself if you make your own chain links. If you just begin by making them in this sort of toroidal shape that's been stretched, they will wobble and move around all by their lonesome before anything happens. And that's another sort of problem with these simulators, which you can work around by increasing the friction, but then that changes the way that the whole system behaves, right? Because our goal in this animation, if I roll it again, just to revel in its beauty and refresh your memory of what happens, is it's got this exaggerated wobble, which we want to have this beautiful demonstration of the physical model. And so if I had to radically increase the friction to stop them from jumping around all by themselves, then we're not going to have that wobble, are we? And so this is the way to fix that, is to just get creative with the shape of the link. And so you see here, we're now in an intermediate frame where gravity is in effect, and look at how nicely they've interlocked. Everything's fitting tightly together now. I'm going to go to a solid mode so you can really see. See? They're just nicely sitting right against each other. Perfect. And let me roll it in the solid mode here, looking right up close. Right from that first frame again. Again, you can see there's that little gap in there that disappears, but watch how nicely everything sits nice and still once it, well, in terms of being jittery. It's swinging a little bit, which is actually a nice thing. But you see, none of the links are really acting strange. They're actually acting quite beautifully, wouldn't you say? I love it. So another thing to show you about the fix that I applied, actually everything that I need to show you about that fix, is not just the fact that it's a rigid body constraint, but it's the type that I chose. The type is hinge. And so this is how we fix that breaking along the y-axis, that gravity rips it apart, is now that by giving it this hinge function, this constraint, it's actually impossible to break the chain, which is a bit of a drag, because if you wanted it to break in your animation, well, you're kind of stuck. And I guess what you can do at that point is actually animate. That's what this little dot here is beside the enabled button, is you can actually animate that property. And so you can choose which frame at which frame you want it to stop being unbreakable. And then, of course, it will immediately break if you've got it under any kind of tension. But that's better than not being able to do it at all, right? So that's the one aspect of it, is by simply choosing the hinge as the constraint. But another thing that's critical is actually a couple of things that I need to show you. First of all, is that I have each of them connected to the next one. So now instead of selecting them all, let me select just this one here, the second from the top. And I've got them numbered. And so you can see here at the top left of this little window, it's being shown what it is that we're dealing with. It's link 2. And if we look here on the top right, we can see that it has been highlighted. That's link 2. And now let's go down here under the rigid body constraint menu, and we see objects. And it says first, I've got link 2, which is this one. Second is link 3, which I'm sure you can guess is the next one down. And so you see when I clicked on that one now, this updates and we see first is now link 3 and second is link 4, which of course, I'm sure you already know, is the next one down. And when we look at that one, it's link 4 and link 5 and so on and so on. So we've got them all linked to the next one. And that's critical. Unfortunately, you have to do them all one at a time, of course, but hopefully your chain isn't too long. Now, the other thing to show you is that all of these links have under the rigid body collection of settings here, the first setting allows you to decide its mass, which I have set to 0.1 kilos, which is a bit of fine tuning in terms of how I want it to behave when it's swinging. That's something you need to establish via trial and error for whatever you're animating or simulating, as it were. And the next is right under it, we've got the dynamic button selected. So that applies to all of the ones except the top one. The top one I have animated. The reason that I have that one animated is because, as you can see, this whole thing is just hanging in air. It's just hanging in space, and it's not falling. And the reason it's not falling is that very reason, is because I have the top link holding everything up, and it's not falling because I have it animated, and the animation consists of nothing. All I had to do is hit that button because I'm animating it not moving. And so when the bell is struck, every link can move and wobble, but not the top one, because the top one is holding everything in place because I have it animated to not move. As counterintuitive as that sounds. And I think that pretty much covers what I wanted to show you. There's lots more that I could explain and show. I suppose one more thing is just in terms of the tuning of this. As I mentioned earlier, I had mentioned that instead of changing the shape of each link of the chain, I could perhaps attempt to increase the friction, which would change its behavior, which is not what we want in this case, because I want that beautiful, wobbly sort of thing when after it's been struck. But the other thing that I changed was the bounciness. And as you can see, I have it set to 1. And when I held the mouse over it, you can see the explanation here says right there that 0 stays still and 1 is perfectly elastic, or somewhere in between. In this case, I did want perfectly elastic. And so I have them set to 1 so that they have their maximum motion when struck. So on that note, I think that's all you need to know to have your own wonderful working chains. So have fun. And if you haven't seen my other Blender video about making your own galaxy, check it out. See what you think. And just like with that one, if you have any questions or comments or suggestions, requests, leave them in the comments. Have fun.